There is a question that has been haunting me recently. Not a financial question, not a career question, not even a relationship question, a human question. A question that sits somewhere at the intersection of love, trust, money, fear, childhood, and self-worth. The question is this: how do you know if someone truly loves you when you are no longer standing at your strongest? For most of my life, I thought I was afraid of financial dependence. I thought my fear was about money. I thought it was about security. I thought it was about freedom. I thought it was about making sure I would never find myself trapped in a situation where I had no options. And while all of those things are part of the story, I have slowly realized that none of them are the whole story. Because if this fear were only about money, it would not hurt the way it does. It would not feel like a threat to my identity. It would not make me question my worth. It would not make me wonder whether I am lovable. It would not make me lose my appetite. It would not make me fear being abandoned. At some point I realized that money was not the real issue. Money was simply the trigger. The real issue was vulnerability. And vulnerability has always frightened me. When I look back at my childhood, I realized that I learned lessons that no child should have to learn. I learned that money can become power. I learned that power can become control. I learned that security can feel fragile. I learned that home can feel uncertain. I learned that the people you depend on emotionally and financially can also be the people who make you feel powerless. Children do not understand these things intellectually. They absorb them emotionally. They absorb them through experience. They absorb them through repetition. And eventually those experiences become beliefs. Invisible beliefs. Beliefs that quietly guide our decisions for years. One of the beliefs I learned was that dependence is dangerous. Another was that vulnerability is dangerous. And perhaps the deepest belief of all was that when someone has power over you, there is always a risk that they will use it against you. When I was younger, I watched situations unfold that taught me to pay very close attention to who had power and who did not. I learned that the person who controls resources often controls more than resources. They control options. They control choices. They control freedom. And somewhere inside me, a promise was born. A promise that I would never allow myself to become trapped. A promise that I would always be able to stand on my own feet. A promise that I would never need anyone. At the time, that promise felt like strength. Now I am beginning to wonder whether it was fear. Because there is a difference between independence and hyper-independence. There is a difference between strength and self-protection. There is a difference between freedom and armor. Many people who experience instability in childhood grow up to become extremely independent adults. They become responsible, capable, reliable, self-sufficient. They become the people everyone admires. The people who always seem to have everything under control. The people who solve their own problems. The people who rarely ask for help. The people who become support systems for everyone else. From the outside, this looks admirable. But what people do not always see is the fear underneath. The fear that says, if I need someone, I might lose myself. If I depend on someone, I might lose my freedom. If I become vulnerable, I might get hurt. If someone has power over me, they might use it against me. And perhaps most painful of all, if I stop being useful, maybe I will stop being loved. That last fear has become impossible for me to ignore. Because recently I found myself in a situation that challenged almost everything I believed about myself. I am building something new, something meaningful, something I care deeply about. I am building my own law firm. At the time of recording this, I am only in the second week. There are no guarantees, no certainty, no predictable salary, no immediate validation. Only work, hope, patience, and uncertainty. And uncertainty has a strange way of bringing old wounds back to life. When everything is going well, we often believe we have healed. When life becomes uncertain, we discover which fears are still living inside us. And suddenly I found myself confronting a terrifying possibility. What if my savings run out before my clients arrive? At first glance, this sounds like a financial concern. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized it was not. The real fear was this. What if someone sees me vulnerable? What if someone sees me needing support? What if someone sees me struggling, and then decides I am no longer worth choosing? That is the fear, not poverty, not budgeting, not mathematics, rejection, abandonment, loss of belonging. Because when I examine my fears honestly, I realize they are all asking the same question. Will I still be chosen if I cannot stand entirely on my own? Will I still be loved if I am not successful? Will I still be respected if I am struggling? Will I still be wanted if I need help? And perhaps the most painful question of all, Am I loved because of who I am or because of what I provide? This fear did not emerge in isolation. Years ago, I went through a period of my life where I finally stopped pretending everything was fine. For years, I had been the supportive friend, the positive friend, the reliable friend, the listener, the helper, the person people could lean on, and then life became difficult. For the first time, I allowed people to see my struggles. For the first time, I needed emotional support myself. And one by one, people disappeared. People who had accepted my support for years suddenly became unavailable when I needed theirs. And whether fair or unfair, a lesson formed inside me, a lesson that reinforced everything I already feared. The lesson was, people like you when you are strong, people like you when you are useful, people like you when you are supportive. But when you become vulnerable, people leave. I do not know if that lesson is true, but I know it feels true. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. The experiences that hurt us most are often the ones that feel true long after they stop being objectively accurate. Now I find myself in a relationship, a serious one. A relationship that has forced me to confront all of these fears at once. Because when we met, I was successful, independent, capable, self-sufficient. The version of myself I felt safest being. And now I find myself wondering, what happens if those things temporarily disappear? What happens if I am no longer the strong one? What happens if I need support? Will he still choose me? Or was he choosing the successful version of me all along? I do not know, and if I am completely honest, I am afraid to find out. Part of me does not want to tell him about my fears. Part of me does not want him to know how worried I am. Part of me does not want him to know how vulnerable I feel. Because there is another lesson I learned growing up. A lesson that many people who experience unhealthy power dynamics learn. The lesson that when certain people discover you are vulnerable, they begin treating you differently. They begin controlling, manipulating, taking advantage. And if that is the lesson your nervous system learned, then vulnerability stops feeling like connection. It starts feeling like danger. You begin hiding your weaknesses. You begin protecting your fears. You begin carrying burdens alone, not because you enjoy it, but because it feels safer. Recently, I noticed something that frightened me. I started skipping meals. At first, I told myself it was about saving money, and perhaps part of it was. But then I caught myself thinking something else, something much deeper, something much sadder. Maybe I do not deserve to eat as much if I am not contributing. The moment I thought that, I realized this was no longer about budgeting. This was about worth. And then I remembered something. The last time I remember losing my appetite like this was when I was a teenager. A period marked by fear, uncertainty, and feeling unwanted. Back then I stopped wanting food because my emotional world felt unsafe. And now, years later, I found myself doing something similar. Not because of hunger, but because of fear. Fear has a way of convincing us to become smaller, to need less, to ask for less, to take up less space, to deserve less. And perhaps that is one of the greatest tragedies of fear. It does not only make us afraid, it makes us shrink. It convinces us that our needs are negotiable, that our humanity is conditional, that our worth depends on our usefulness. But the more I reflect on all of this, the more I realize that perhaps the real question is not whether I can survive without support. I already know I can survive. I have been surviving my entire life. Perhaps the real question is whether I can learn to believe that being loved and being supported are not the same thing as being controlled. Perhaps the real question is whether I can learn that receiving does not automatically create debt. That vulnerability does not automatically create danger. That needing help does not automatically create abandonment. And maybe, just maybe, this chapter of my life is not testing whether I am strong enough. Maybe it is testing whether I am willing to let reality challenge old beliefs. Because there is something important I have come to realize. A healthy family is not built on never needing each other. A healthy family is built on being able to need each other without fear. Life guarantees vulnerability, pregnancy, illness, loss, career transitions, unexpected setbacks. No one gets through life without eventually needing support. The question is not whether vulnerability will come. The question is whether the people around us make vulnerability safe. And perhaps this is why this period feels so important. Not because of the money, not because of the business, but because it is revealing something deeper. It is revealing the relationship I have with trust, the relationship I have with dependence, the relationship I have with worth, the relationship I have with being loved. And perhaps the most difficult realization of all is this. The fear that people will leave when I need them has already been influencing my life for years. It has influenced my friendships, my relationships, my decisions, my willingness to ask for help, my willingness to be seen, my willingness to trust. And while fear may protect us from disappointment, it also protects us from connection. It protects us from discovering that some people might stay. It protects us from discovering that some people might actually be safe. It protects us from discovering that support and control are not the same thing. And maybe healing is not about becoming fearless. Maybe healing is about becoming curious. Curious enough to question the beliefs fear gave us. Curious enough to ask whether every lesson from our past still applies to our present. Curious enough to consider that vulnerability and safety might be able to coexist. If there is one thing I would tell anyone who recognizes themselves in this story, it is this: pay attention to the stories your fear is telling you, but do not automatically treat them as facts. Fear often speaks in absolutes. Everyone leaves, no one helps. Dependence is dangerous. Vulnerability is weakness. People only love you when you are useful. Fear loves certainty. Reality is usually more nuanced. Second, separate practical problems from emotional wounds. A financial challenge is real. A business challenge is real. But they are not necessarily evidence that you are unlovable, unsafe, or destined to be abandoned. Do not allow old emotional injuries to write the story of every present challenge. Third, examine the difference between support and control. Support expands your options. Control reduces them. Support respects your autonomy. Control threatens it. Learning this distinction can change your life. Fourth, notice whether you are shrinking yourself because you are afraid. Whether that means not asking for help, not expressing needs, not eating properly, not sharing your struggles. Fear often asks us to become smaller. Healing asks us to remain fully human. And finally, remember this: your worth is not determined by your income. Your worth is not determined by your productivity. Your worth is not determined by how little you need. Your worth is not determined by how much suffering you can endure in silence. You are not more valuable when you are successful. You are not less valuable when you are struggling. You do not become a burden because life becomes difficult. And you do not need to earn the right to be loved. If I am completely honest, I wish I could end this video by telling you that I have figured all of this out. I wish I could tell you that I am no longer afraid. I wish I could tell you that I know exactly what to do. But that would not be true. The truth is that I am still struggling. The truth is that I am still afraid. The truth is that I still do not know exactly how this chapter will unfold. I do not know what my business will look like 6 months from now. I do not know what conversations I will have. I do not know what answers I will receive. I do not know whether every fear I carry will prove true or false. What I do know is that I am trying. I am trying to understand myself. I am trying to understand where these fears come from. I am trying to separate old wounds from present reality. I am trying to trust myself enough to navigate uncertainty. I am trying to believe that vulnerability does not automatically lead to pain. Some days I succeed. Some days I don't. Some days I feel strong. Some days I feel terrified. Some days I believe every lesson in this video. Some days I struggle to believe any of them. And maybe that is what growth actually looks like. Not certainty, not perfection, not arriving, but continuing. Continuing despite fear. Continuing despite uncertainty. Continuing despite not knowing exactly how the story ends. I am still learning. I am still healing. I am still questioning. I am still a work in progress. And perhaps that is not a weakness. Perhaps that is simply what it means to be human. If you are going through something similar, please share your thoughts and advice in the comments. Please like and follow. And as always, yours humbly, Just the Eldest Daughter.